Sounds good. Okay, thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and especially in your evening time. I know these are precious times with the kids trying to get everything done, so I appreciate you coming on. So today we're talking all about speech sound support. So I'm a speech language pathologist, and I'm just going to lead you through the development of speech sounds, and we'll talk about assessment and intervention today. And feel free to stop me at any time, but like Nisheen had mentioned, we'll have time for some questions and things at the end when we're not recording. So today we're going to plan to go through the developmental milestones of speech sound development, talk about how they typically progress and what to do if they're not progressing along those lines. We'll talk about the different types of speech sound disorders that are out there, and then talk a little bit about the assessment process. And then, of course, we'll spend quite a bit of time with strategies and ideas for home, because that's really what we want to know. And I'll give some specific ideas for certain speech sounds as well, especially the common ones that our kids have difficulty with. So that's the agenda for today. But of course, I'm flexible, so keep me posted if you want anything adapted, for sure. So the next few slides are based on typical speech sound development. We'll talk about the sounds and how they typically progress. What we're going to be looking at is the age at which 90% of children use the sounds correctly. There's always going to be some variability from child to child, but we're going to be looking at the time at which most children are using these sounds correctly. So we'll start with the little itty bitties, the 1-year-olds. So by age 1, we're starting to see kids say their first words. There's usually been a lot of babbling before that, mama, mama, mas, the ba-ba-bas. And then so we start to see the first words developing after that. So first words are often mama, up, ball for ball, maybe high. There are all these consonants like the M's, the P's, the B's, H's, W's. They're things that are very easy to articulate. There's not a lot of complexity to them. And even when our kids are saying them, even though we know them really well, we only understand them maybe 25 up to 50% of the time, but they're pretty unintelligible usually at this age. It's totally normal. Then by the time we get to age 2, the kids are going to continue using those same sounds that they've been using at age 1, but we see T's and N's kind of get added to what they can also pronounce. That's being said, they're not going to be using these in every position of a word. They might say a word like down without the N at the end. They might say down, or just a shortened version of that. And that's completely normal. By the time they reach kind of the end of that second year, we start to see maybe some sounds a little bit at the end of words, but usually they're marking that beginning sound and not articulating every single sound in the word. At this age, though, their intelligibility, or how much we understand them, raises to about half the time, even up to 75% of the time by familiar people. Less familiar people definitely would be lower than that. But they really start developing those. And then by the time they reach age 3, they start to learn how to use sounds at the back of the mouth. So the K, the G, and the ing sounds are all made kind of with the back of your mouth. It's a little bit more complex. And this is where sometimes we see sound development break down a little bit, because that's harder for kids usually. So age 3, we start to see those back sounds develop, and also some sounds that are a little bit more complex, like your F sound, you have to isolate one lip from the other. So that starts to develop around age 3 as well. And they should also be using those sounds at the beginning and end of words a lot more consistently than when they were 2 now. And speech intelligibility should be at least at that 75% mark. And that's again by familiar people. Unfamiliar people certainly it would be significantly lower. And moving on to our little 4-year-olds, they would be using all those sounds that a 3-year-old uses, but they also start developing some of these more complex sounds, like your L's, your J sounds, your Ch for CH, your S, V, SH, Z, all of those should be starting to come. They're probably not perfectly articulated at that point, but those should be starting to develop. And they should have good intelligibility where we understand them most of the time. For sure, there would still be communication breakdowns. They'd still be needing to point to things or show us some of the time, but we'd like to see all those sounds starting to develop. And then really after this, there's only a few remaining sounds. So for 5-year-olds, we start to see R, which is one of the harder sounds out there. So we should be starting to see that. Before that point, they've probably replaced their R's with W's, but at this age, we should start to hear some R's there. And then they also start to use what we call the voiced TH. So there's a lot of pairs of sounds in the English language. So for example, the F and the V sound are considered like a pair of sounds. And that means that they are the exact same articulation, your lips, your tongue, everything is the exact same placement for an F and a V. Everything is placed the same. The only difference is that your vocal folds are more active when you are making a V sound. So you can actually feel them vibrate if you touch your throat when you do the V, versus an F, they're quiet, they're not vibrating. So all that means a voiced TH is a little bit easier for kids to make than a voiceless TH. Voiced TH is when your vocal folds are moving. So for words like the, you can feel that. Whereas voiceless TH, they're not moving. It turns into like a word like thigh would have that. So even though we have them written the same way in the English language, both THs, they are pronounced differently. So that's a little speech language therapy for you. And at age 5, again, they should be easy to understand. Even unfamiliar listeners shouldn't have much difficulty understanding them. So that they really should be coming along with those speech sounds now. And at age 6, we finally get that voiceless TH. So that should be coming along, and then really cleaning up that R. Any remaining speech sounds should all be there now. So that's age 6. So now we get into what happens if they haven't developed those sounds at those ages. That is when we refer for assessment for sure. There's a few other times when we might refer for assessment. If the child ever loses some speech sounds they were using before, if they get very frustrated when they're talking because they're not being understood a lot of the time, or if you compare them to their peers and they're significantly harder to understand. Again, there's always going to be some variability with speech sounds and how they develop, but if they're not easily understood compared to their peers, then that might be a time to refer for assessment as well. We'll talk a bit more about the assessment piece very soon. I'm just going to run you through just the different types of speech sound disorders now. So we're mostly going to talk about articulation and what that is today and what to do with an articulation disorder or delay. But there's also phonological disorders we'll touch on, motor speech disorders. And then we're not really going to talk about sensory disorders like hearing loss and the speech sounds that would be affected from hearing loss. We're not really going to touch on that today, but certainly let me know if you have questions. And we're also not really going to touch on structural speech sound disorders. Like if a child has a cleft lip or palate, we definitely would see patterns of speech sound errors as well, but we won't really touch on that too much today. We're going to focus mostly on the articulation, but I'll explain these other ones as well, so you know what I'm talking about. So getting into articulation. So this is the most common type of speech sound disorder out there. Usually the child just has difficulty producing one sound or a couple of these harder sounds. Usually they're the sounds that develop later. And the common culprits are your L's, your THs, R's, and S. Sometimes we even see like the CH and the J sounds sneak in there. And really, it's just a couple sounds affected. The kids still have good speech intelligibility. They're still usually pretty easy to understand, with the exception of a sound or two. So that's articulation. Those are going to be our easiest ones to treat. So that's what we're going to focus mostly on today. Then we get into what's called a phonological disorder. So this is a speech sound difficulty that is all about the patterns of language. So children will have difficulty with a whole group of sounds. So for example, we often see consonant cluster reduction or deletion. So again, speech therapy 101, bear with me. What that means is when there's two consonants that occur together, like say the S and the P for spin, like in our little picture example there. So spin, whenever they have two consonants together, one of them gets dropped. So spin would become pin. Can't tell you how many times I've heard Spider-Man is Spider-Man, snack, knack. So a whole group of sounds is affected with a phonological disorder like this. It's completely normal for kids to go through these stages when they're developing their speech sounds, but we like to see these things resolve usually by 3.5. It depends a little bit on the type of difficulty we're seeing, but it's normal to have them, but then they need to grow out of it. So we're here to help if they don't grow out of it. Another type of pattern of error that I see a lot is called stopping. So it's when kids take these long flowing sounds like S and F, and they turn them into short choppy sounds. So C becomes T, leaf might become leap. They just take all those long sounds, chop them into short sounds. So again, it's just this whole group of sounds that's affected. All these patterns get impacted. So also very common to see. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then our last group that we're just going to touch on a little bit today is motor speech disorders. So there are two main types of motor speech disorders. There's apraxia, which is caused to difficulty with motor planning, figuring out how to position your tongue and your mouth when you're turning on your vocal folds. It's being able to figure out all those things, sequence them, and then execute those movements all together. With kids with apraxia, sometimes we see that they come out with amazing sentences or words, and then we don't hear them again. They have a lot of variability with their errors as well. So that's another thing we look out for. Really, you would get this information in an assessment with a speech pathologist, although these types of disorders can be a little bit harder to diagnose and take some time usually. The other main type of motor speech disorder is dysarthria. So that's when there's actually nerve damage or muscle damage or weakness that is impacting speech sounds. So sometimes we see accompanying things like drooling or that thing as well. So that's another one that we definitely work on, but is very guided by the speech pathologist. So we're not going to go too much into those today. So just going to keep barreling on unless there's any questions. We're going to go into intervention. Okay, so intervention. What happens if we think something is going on? Speech sounds haven't developed the way that we've covered already. Then we're going to go into this assessment piece. So if I see kids online just through the home learners, that type of thing, what I do is a bit of a screening. It's not a full assessment, whereas we would want a full assessment. We're going in to look at oral motor abilities and language screenings and to try to figure out exactly what's going on. But with our screenings and our little bits of assessments we can do online, we can usually figure out which category kids are fitting into. Is it an articulation difficulty? Is it phonological, or is there motor speech? So with the motor speech, it's highly individualized depending on the child's area of difficulty. So we're not going to go too much into how to treat that just because it's so variable depending on the child. The phonological impairments follow a lot of similar therapy strategies as articulation, but then we're mostly going to focus on articulation today. So just a quick note about motor speech therapy. This is usually done in a very intensive manner, at least 3 times a week. We'd like to see for most motor speech disorders. So they need that repetitive, intensive practice. There's a lot more cueing that's usually required for motor speech disorder therapy. A lot more visual cues needed, more tactile cues. Just that auditory is not enough to help our kids out. So they need definitely more intensive practice and more intensive cueing. So again, that's going to be really guided by the SLP, or speech language pathologist. You see the SLP everywhere. That's what it stands for. Versus we have motor speech therapy, where it's highly individualized. And then we have articulation therapy, where it's this nice step-by-step hierarchy for the most part. So articulation therapy, we know where we're starting. We know where we're going to go to with each step in our little hierarchy here. So I'll talk a little bit about each step here. This is why we're going to cover articulation therapy the most, just because we know exactly how to progress with it. So here's our example. So the first step back in our orange level of the hierarchy is auditory discrimination, just hearing the difference between two sounds. So making sure that the child can tell the difference between your snake sound. Let's try to make your snake sound. Did I make it right? Seeing if they can judge that versus, can you hear the difference? Which time am I making your snake sound? So making sure that they can hear that difference. The next step in that hierarchy is practicing the sound on its own. So that's what we call isolation. So just practicing, let's keep our tongue behind our teeth when we make our snake sound. Just going to practice that over and over. We can definitely do this in games, and we'll talk about that after so that it doesn't get too boring for our kids. But that's where we're going to stay at. And I should say each level in this hierarchy, you're not going to blow through it all in one day. You definitely are going to be staying at each level for a period of time. Sometimes it's days, sometimes it's weeks, sometimes it can even be months. So just depending on how quickly your child progresses, usually we would spend at least several weeks there, just depending on practice and how quickly they come along with things. So you might be practicing at that isolation level with your S sound for a while until they can make a nice clear S. Then once they can do that about 80% of the time on their own, they make 8 productions. They remember how to do their S sound with their tongue behind their teeth 8 out of the 10 times. The other 2 times they need some reminders from you. Then they're ready to move on to that next step. Here I have the example. It's syllables. The example is so. You can practice see, saw, just any sample words like that. And then again, we're going to stay at that level till they're 80% consistent, and then we're going to move to what we call broken words. Sometimes kids can jump right to words, but broken words would just be separating the S sound, or whichever sound you're working on, L, TH, from the rest of the word, just with a pause. Awk. Can you say that with me? Awk. So you're just separating it a little bit there. And then again, you're going to stay at that level for a period of time till the child is 80% consistent at that broken word level, and then you're going to move up the hierarchy. So that's how it goes the whole time, step by step by step. It's really nicely broken down. And that's why we're talking mostly about it today. We don't have all these difficulties and tricky things to work on where we would encounter with motor speech therapy. Just some general pointers for working on speech sounds. We usually practice imitative productions before spontaneous. So imitative means you're just going to make it first, and then you're going to have your child imitate. So I practice the S, and then they imitate after me. That makes it a lot easier if I can see somebody else make the S with their tongue behind their teeth, and then easier for me to produce it as well. Spontaneous is them just, okay, you try to say your snake sound now for 5 times. So that would be spontaneous. And then, like I mentioned earlier, we move to that next step in the hierarchy after they're 80% independent. And then we also use, for kids who need that, visual cues, gestural cues, and descriptions. We'll go into some tips for each speech sound after this, but it's often like when we're sticking with the S example, I'll go S. We practice our snake sound, we give it that fun name, we give that gestural cue, describe it. Let's keep our tongue behind our teeth, or we can describe in more detail where we put our tongue. It's going to go on the bump behind our top front teeth. That's called our alveolar ridge, we tell older kids. So we can give that description as well. Use of a mirror is very helpful depending on the sound you're working on. Some are more visible than others, but for kids who have difficulty with THs, those are very visible. S's usually are quite visible. Some of these sounds is very, very helpful to do a video or mirror. And I also like to encourage the kids to rate their own productions or judge their own productions. What did you think? Did you make a clear snake sound that time? Did you make a clear S? So that they have to start thinking about it. And I encourage them to do that for me too. So they rate mine and let me know if I've made an error, just because they're going to need those skills to be able to monitor their own productions before they're going to be able to generalize those skills to conversation. And then usually we work on the sound in different word positions. Most of the time we start with, it says initial there, the first sound in the word. So like our example, the sock example, you're working on the S at the beginning of the word. Then usually we move, once they're very good with beginning of the word, we move to the end of the word. And then the trickiest is usually medial or the middle of the word, because that's more complex, usually a longer word. Kids are paying attention to where that S or that key sound is. It's a lot harder than when it just comes right at the beginning of the word and they can just focus on it. So we got to target all of those things. Oops. And now we'll just talk a little bit about the common sounds and how we can kind of cue our kids to use them. Nasheen, I don't know if maybe you want to stop the recording here as I get into these in case there's any questions.
Yeah, I'll stop it now.
Okay, sounds good. So I'll get into these sound specific prompts.